All right, I've got the post-lunch slot, so I will try to keep this discussion of ocean mapping and labor history in Peru as snappy and exciting as possible. I am a cultural anthropologist, so I don't study the urban or factories, but Ross assured me that this would work, so we'll see how it goes. I want to start off today talking a little bit about the work that I've been doing in Peru over the past 5 years on fisheries and class politics in fisheries, which is already maybe starting to feel like a bit of a departure from the theme. But I want to talk about this in the context or in relation to ocean mapping in Peru and the ways in which the mapping of ocean territory have been linked into the ongoing production of different interiors and exteriors, and the way that that's linked up to class politics as it relates to natural resources. So I'm going to start off and provide a historical narrative, kind of walking us all through some of what's happened in Peru in the past 50 or 60 years, and then end up with some suggestions, thoughts about how this potentially links in. So hold on. This is going to be like a mystery novel, I think, and we'll save the excitement for the very end, which hopefully works. So in any case, to start off, Peru's coastal and marine geography has for a very long time provided people with access to one of the most productive fisheries in the world. The Humboldt Current produces an upwelling of cold, low salinity water along South America's west coast, and it basically meets the central Peruvian coast in really the most perfect way possible, so that you can have easy access to a whole lot of fish mass. Prior to the arrival of the Spaniards, the abundance of Peru's coastal waters helped to power the development of complex societies and economies. Urban settlements and sophisticated architecture sprang up along Peru's coast at about the time that Egyptian civilization was flourishing over 4,000 years ago. During the 20th century, Peru's marine fisheries made the country the largest exporter of fish meal in the world, and contributed to the dramatic reorganization of the country's coastal and marine spaces. Today, what I'm setting out to do is to examine the double internalities, to borrow a phrase from Jason Moore, of the dual processes whereby Pacific marine natures made the expansion of capital possible during Peru's fish meal boom, and also how the fish industry reorganized and reclassified ocean natures in ways that secured the ongoing accumulation of capital. Moore argues that capitalism is, above all, the system of organizing nature, and it survived not by destroying nature, whatever that might mean or look like, but through projects that compel nature to work harder and harder for free or at a very low cost. In other words, capitalism can't survive without producing and securing uncommodified cheap natures, such as food, fuel, or other kinds of unpaid work, that enable capitalists to produce surplus value by avoiding overcapitalization and rising labor costs. And these are two very important factors in thinking about fisheries, both in Peru and other places. What I'm interested in doing here, and the link that I see to the broader theme of the conference, is to explore the state's and also the fish meal industry's ongoing efforts to organize nature and labor in ways that make the production of surplus values possible. A key aspect of this has been the legal, cultural, and natural, in all senses of the word, production of exteriors that can be appropriated through emerging technologies of scientific discovery, mapping, and governance. I'm particularly concerned with two things. Number one, how this process has obscured, if incompletely, the industry's role in producing contemporary limits to marine productivity, rather than being a condition of pre-existing ocean nature. And also, number two, dispossessing poor laborers and artisanal fishers by relegating them to natural and legal exteriors through the production of industrial fisheries as the unmarked interior of marine production. This dynamic, as you might imagine, has intensified over the past few decades as climate change and overfishing have impacted Peruvian fish stocks, as well as fish stocks around the world. A consideration of this dynamic, I think, is important for analyzing spatial production and maintenance of contemporary inequalities, and underscores the ways in which capitalism, power, and knowledge combine in the present to concentrate wealth as well as harm in different spaces. So, just to start, let me get to, whoops, this is what I want. This is an important baseline, or it's an important thing to just set out from the beginning, and I'll explain later on why this particular bifurcation and categorization exists. Basically, at present in Peru, the fish industry is divided into two major categories. The first is the industrial fishery, which is almost entirely export-oriented. 97–98% of the fish that the industry captures goes to exports, and it goes to exports of fish meal. So this is fish for indirect human consumption. These are large boats, they're over 32.5 metric tons. These are mostly trawlers and some smaller purse seiners. Okay, so they basically go out nets. It's scoop up large quantities, mostly of anchovies. And produces a relatively small and diminishing number of people. So about 18,000 people, if not a little bit less than that. The other important category, and these are legal categories, is artisanal fishing and the artisanal fishery, which employs a much larger number of people than the industrial fishery. It's concentrated primarily, but not exclusively, in near coast waters, and these are mostly people fishing with wooden boats, not a lot of mechanization. And in contrast to the industrial fishery, this is a fishery that is oriented almost entirely to domestic production of fish. Fish that people are actually eating. And Peruvians eat over twice as much fish as anybody else in the Americas. So they eat a lot of fish. This is an important food fishery. So part of my talk is explaining why this bifurcation exists and how it came about. And the important key to thinking about a lot of this is the anchovy. This is the Peruvian anchovy, the anchoveta. Some of you have probably eaten anchovies, but have not necessarily eaten these guys. Most of the anchovies that we eat in the United States, canned ones, come from the Mediterranean. Peruvian anchovy, this specific, the Peruvian anchoveta, is the single most caught fish in the world. This fish accounts for more tons of fish protein landed than any other single fish in the world. And it's a fish that exists in great abundance along the Peruvian coast because of the cold water upwelling that happens very close to shore. This fish, in many ways, captured people, and people captured it, and in the process, completely transformed Peru's coastal economy during the 1950s and the 1960s. In the span of a decade, the Peruvian fishery switched from one that was focused primarily on capturing food for people to eat to capturing anchovies to export as fish meal. The anchovy boom led to increased differentiation among fishers in Peru's central coast. As state and private investments in the fish meal industry helped to foster a growing fleet of mid and large-scale boats oriented basically for capturing anchovies and nothing else. This is particularly the case along Peru's central coast from Callao, which is the port city of Lima, up to Chimbote in the north-central coast, which became the primary hub for fish meal production. During the 1950s, 1960s, a relatively small period of time, the number of registered fishers in the country more than doubled. Largely as a result of peasant migration from the highlands to the coast, which supplied labor to the growing industry. Once the boom subsided in the 1970s, the number of boats and fishers in Peru had more than doubled. And basically the artisanal sector was born at this point. It reabsorbed a lot of the labor that the industrial fishery had relied on to get going in the first place. In his early study of Peru's fish meal industry, Michael Romer argues that the coalescing of several scientific, technological, and economic developments between the 1940s and 1960s made the fish meal boom possible. The first, and this is an interesting link to Iowa State. People always ask me why I'm at Iowa State and working on fisheries in the Pacific, and one of them is so that it's my job to leave Iowa State from time to time and go and see the ocean. One of the other kind of interesting links is that it was at Iowa State where much of the early science was developed that demonstrated that if you fed chickens and pigs a small portion of fish meal, that they would put on lean weight fast and could go to market faster. This discovery fueled a boom around the world in fish meal production during the 1950s and the 1960s. In Peru, there was a bonito boom in the 1940s, which actually laid some of the early infrastructure for the anchovy boom. Basically, early producers, when there wasn't enough bonito, started looking for other things that they could reduce to fill the capacity, and started searching after first herring and then later anchovies, and discovered that they were really pretty good at making anchovy meal. The other important change that occurred was in 1956, nylon nets were introduced to Peru. Prior to this, the nets had been made out of cotton. And cotton nets are very heavy. They absorb a lot of water, and they also don't last very long. So the simple introduction of nylon nets made it possible to extract greater quantities of fish, because the nets themselves didn't weigh that much and also lasted a lot longer, which permitted the use of larger boats. You could use larger boats, and it also afforded some economies of scale. The other final and kind of important factor in this was that the military governments of Manuel Odria from 1948 to 1956 reversed import substitution in Peru, and also encouraged the development of the fish meal boom in the country. In particular, the government reversed course on import substitution, which was relatively short-lived in Peru compared to places like Argentina and Chile, by removing price controls, devaluing the currency, dismantling protectionist tariffs, and restricting credit to export industries. It also cracked down on labor, as did the following governments. And one of the important things that they did was, in conjunction with the industry, to exclude fishers from existing labor protections and classifying them not as wage or piece workers, but as task workers. A move that enabled boat owners to avoid paying Social Security or taxes on fishers. This is all to say that, among other factors, Peru's initial anchovy boom was made possible by an abundance of politically produced cheap labor and free nature. The number of active fishers boomed as a result of increased migration from the Andes to the coast. Beginning in the 1950s, shortages in arable land and agricultural work pushed masses of people out of the mountains down the coast. The fish industry provided significant opportunities for absorbing this labor and not paying it very much. Chimbote in particular was emblematic of this. This is a city that, if you go to, it smells of fish oil. This is the center of fish production. The city hosted the first plant built with the express purpose of processing anchovies, and between 1950 and 1960, its population quadrupled. And it quadrupled again in the 2 decades that followed. The sheer number of people who arrived on the coast in search of work during these decades not only provided the fishing industry a ready labor pool, but it also exerted downward pressure on wages. Furthermore, the Peruvian state also made the first concerted efforts during this period to establish and territorialize the ocean in protection of the industry. In the face of increased fishing pressure from American and also Japanese ships, especially for tuna and other pelagic or open ocean fishes, during 1947, Peru issued a decree stating that it had sovereign waters out to 200 nautical miles. At the time, the established limit around the world was 12 nautical miles. And in the decades that followed, Chile and Ecuador also got in on this and made a case for it. Something that was very quickly rejected by the US government, which had a clear interest in being able to make up for the fisheries that had basically collapsed in California at this time by fishing off of the Mexican, Peruvian, Ecuadorian coast. It wasn't actually resolved until the early 1980s, to the Reagan government. The territorialization of the city, that is, I guess, a hard word. It's an awful word. We probably need a better word or a different word. represented the state's attempt to establish itself as the ultimate authority of Peru's ocean resources, both in the water and along the seabed. An attempt that at least legally made the traditional use rights of small-scale fishers in coastal communities invisible. I feel like I'm already starting to run out of time, so I'm going to skip over a few things here. One of the important developments of this was that by about the late 1960s, the industry was already starting to experience issues with overcapitalization as a result of, and also overfishing. Basically, the fleet was too big. The number of fish were already starting to go down. And the way that the government solved this was basically to establish its right to the sea, but then also to nationalize the fish meal industry. And in the process, it basically cut the number of people working in the fish meal industry by about half. So there was increased vertical integration, concentration, and also basically the birth of the modern artisanal fishing sector. Because the people who had migrated to the coast in search of work and who had initially helped to make the anchovy boom possible were then ejected from the industry and absorbed by the kind of small-scale coastal fleet. So the number of fishers working in the artisanal fishery by the early 1970s had doubled from what it had been just a few decades before. If you look at Chorrillos, which is an urban artisanal fishing port where I've been working for the past 4 or 5 years, in 1943 there were 69 boats, including canoes, and 232 registered fishers. By 1970, the numbers had grown to 144 boats and 420 fishers. So oftentimes, artisanal fishers have been the object of different kinds of state development projects and concerns from time to time. We'll talk about that in a second. And oftentimes are targeted for being this kind of holdover, being quote unquote traditional fishers who have not evolved with the times and are therefore inefficient producers. And within that narrative are oftentimes classed as being pre-modern, pre-industrial, traditional. When in fact, if you look at the labor history, they could, if you're into these kinds of categorizations, could just as easily be conceptualized as being post-industrial fishers. These are the people who were kind of left after the industry boomed and was able to continue making a profit by becoming more technologically efficient and shedding all these jobs. In the ensuing decades, and as a result of this kind of reorganization, the industry, although it faltered with the El Niños in 72 and 82, there was a closed fishery in 83, continued to tick upwards as global demand for fish meal increased. By 94, anchovy catches had rebounded to their 1971 levels, and in the early 1990s, the Fujimori government aimed to reinvigorate the fishery by increasing its export capacity and further privatizing and dismantling the state-owned fishing company. While different international groups encouraged the Peruvian government to cut the fleet and institute more stringent catch limits, this was basically ignored. Well, the government required that in order to commission new boats, old ones had to be decommissioned. The reality was that in many cases, small-scale industrial boats continued to catch anchovies illegally. The result was the overcapacitation of the industry. By 2000, experts estimated that the industrial fleet was 2.5 to 5 times larger than it needed to be to catch the average annual limit of anchovies. Or to put it in another way, the fleet could basically catch the existing anchovies 5 times over in a year. The General Fisheries Law of '92 sought to deal with this by declaring that the fish stocks were part of Peru's national heritage and therefore the state had the right to regulate all fishing. As part of this, the Fujimori government introduced a new measure, additional limits on the geography of the ocean, reserving a 5-mile line from the coast to 5 nautical miles for artisanal fishers, while 5 miles out to 200 miles was for industrial boats. At the time, there really was very little resistance from the industry because this didn't have a major impact. This changed recently, though, when the government just a few years back instituted an additional limit. So now in addition to the 5-mile limit, there's also a 10-mile limit, which is for the kind of mid-scale industrial boats. In the past decade, the fish industry has focused increasingly on efficiency and quality in order to wrest value from stable but overexploited anchovy stocks. So in 2008, the Peruvian government instituted a system of individual vessel quotas. So basically, each boat can only catch so many anchovies in a year. As a number of people have noted, this encouraged fish meal producers to consolidate their quotas in a relatively small number of large vessels, thus improving efficiencies and put greater effort into landing high quality stocks so that they could sell their meal for greater prices, basically as prime and also super prime fish meal in order to increase value. In the years that followed the IVQ, the grade of Peruvian fish meal has increased, and the price that people pay for fish meal has also increased. This is a development that's encouraged artisanal, along with small-scale industrial boats, to illegally harvest anchovy for fish meal within near-coast waters. So in 2012, the government took further steps to protect the anchovy stocks and really to protect the industry when it issued Supreme Decree 005. The decree changed the way that Peru's marine waters were divvied up. So there's now a 5-mile limit in which only artisanal fishers are allowed to capture anchovies. And the length of the boats was changed. So it went from just over 32 metric tons of hold capacity down to 10. Fishers fishing in the zone for anchovies are supposed to fish only if they fish for anchovies for direct human consumption. There's been a big there's been government rhetoric about fishing anchovies to feed to poor people in Peru. In reality, there's no market for this. This is something that exists on a government website, and otherwise there is no market for people to catch anchovies to sell them for human consumption. The second zone is for the Viking fleet, the small industrial boats that range from 10 metric tons up to 32.5. They are allowed to fish the 5 to 10 nautical mile zone. 90% of their catch is supposed to go to canning, 10% is allowed to go to fish meal. Again, the reality is that there's almost no canned fish market in Peru. And then from 10 nautical miles out to 200 is reserved for the industry. Despite the fact that this actually protects industry interests quite well, the industry has been vehemently opposed to this. Which is also included in this was a very interesting step. In 2012, the government announced that it would conduct the first, I put this in quotes because it's not really true, the first national census of artisanal fishers as a way of demonstrating to the industry that it was willing to start regulating and making artisanal fishers more visible to state regulation. Since the industry has always basically argued that they're the ones who are regulated and who follow the rules, and it's artisanal fishers who are the problem. Despite these measures, industry leaders fiercely resisted the decree. Some fish processing companies owned small-scale industrial boats and were able to skirt their quotas by buying fish from small-scale industrial boats. The decree effectively closed that loophole. However, the amount of fish meal produced this way was relatively small. So, I mean, it alone doesn't really explain the resistance that the industry mounted to the new law. Rather, the resistance appears to have emerged out of industry concern that the state was taking on too great a role in regulating and territorializing Peru's ocean spaces. The government of Ollanta, which is the government that instituted this new decree, entered office as a center-left candidate who promised to rein in Peru's extractive industries, particularly mining, but also the fish industry for the good of the state and its poor citizens. Upon office, he quickly reversed course and largely adopted a neoliberal extractivist approach to economic growth. But his appointment for the Minister of Production, was someone who's a career technocrat. He's the first person in the history of the ministry who didn't come from the fish industry. And so there was a lot of concern over the fact that the state was basically overstepping its right to territorialize the ocean. It was the industry that wanted the power to define the boundaries of ocean production in order to secure and continue to secure its cheap natures. So you see, we not only have in this era this kind of process of mapping out the ocean as far as productivity of anchovies, but there's also increased concern and efforts by both the government and the industry as well to map out the seafloor and to start exploring different zones of the ocean as well as a possibility potentially of making up for shortages in other fisheries. You see the distribution of anchovy along the coast. Beginning in about 2000, there was increased scientific work on mapping out the different, all the different factors that may impact fish stocks and fish production. So increased science and mapping around things like ocean temperature, currents, the distribution of different fish stocks at different times of years, as well as increased efforts to map out bathymetric work in the ocean as well, of mapping out the seafloor, and the dispersion of different fishes and different fisheries in Peru's waters. One of the results of this was that beginning in about 2000, an increased number of small-scale industry boats started targeting pota, which is jumbo squid. And it's not a fish that Peruvians have traditionally eaten, but it yields a kind of firm white flesh, and so it's become a cheap alternative to a lot of the white-fleshed fish that have largely been overfished out of Peruvian waters. And it's the one that's a ground fish. It's a demersal, although I guess legally they technically classified as a mollusk. But this is one of the fisheries to have emerged out of that, those processes of kind of mapping and searching for new stocks, new marine resources that could be exploited. You can see the Humboldt Trench pretty clearly here along the coast, and why Peru is such a fantastic place for fishery, because the deep water basically comes right up to the coast in a way that is quite unique to Peru's geography. I should probably stop soon, right? We're getting close to stopping. Perfect. Amidst growing concerns about the Anthropocene, the ocean has reemerged as an actor in postmodern life, threatening to devour urban coastlines and swamp metropolitan centers around the world. However, discussions about climate change and rising sea levels continue to frame the ocean as an external nature, a sink that can no longer absorb melting glaciers and islands of plastic waste. In this guise, the ocean functions as a fluid antithesis to the material and symbolic organization of terra firma through urban development. However, as I've tried to demonstrate in this paper, I don't know that I necessarily got there, maybe another half hour at some point. Such depictions deny the double internalities of ocean nature and capitalism, suggesting how widely circulating concepts of urban, rural, wild spaces, as the ocean is often classified in Peru, conspire to reinforce the production of exteriors that mask the historical co-production and entanglement of such spaces. The ocean is not a natural resource, but a historical entity whose limitations are the products of the historically contingent ways in which capitalism has organized ocean natures. Peru's fish meal industry has confronted these limitations, which it produced in part by trying to extract value through the development of new efficiencies in production technologies, increasing the value-added qualities of fish meal and growing constraints on small-scale fishers, who have shouldered the repeated burdens of the industry's reorganization of nature and labor. It's also worth noting, it's purely suggestive, I guess, at this point, that this process is part of a broader reorganization of hemispheric and global ocean natures and resources. As overfishing, overcapitalization, and rising labor costs have led to the virtual end of captured fisheries for cod, salmon, and other species in the United States, Canada, and Scandinavia, aquaculture has emerged as a low-cost means of producing much desired fish protein with very little labor compared to traditional fisheries. It was cheap nature in the form of fish meal from Chile and Peru that made aquaculture possible, particularly salmon aquaculture in places like Canada, since farm salmon consume roughly 6 times their body weight in feed before they're ready for harvest. As limits to southern fisheries have driven up the quality and cost of fish meal, the race has been on to change the nature, the genetic nature, of farm fish themselves to make them able to put on weight faster and thus use less meal. And so the race to identify and overcome the next barrier to accumulation continues.
Thank you. Very nice. Since we're running just a bit behind time, if anyone has, we can maybe take one or two very brief questions, and we'll move on.
Yes, I have a question. First of all, in case it makes you feel more relevant, I should note that Jason Moore has also been a steady reference for us as well.
Also.
But in relation to that, I was wondering, I couldn't help make the distinction between interior and exterior in the case of this exclusive economic zone definition. And it seems that also what you mentioned in your summary in the end, that there is a concern about more macroscopic phenomena like climate change that cannot actually be regulated. So we see all this effort to regulate what is happening within these 200 miles. However, there might be a change in the stream that destroys the whole capacity for cheap nature, for example.
Yeah.
Is this also part of the concerns of the governments, or they are just too much invested in?
So 2 questions. The first, I think the interior-exterior distinction is not. I think I muddled that a little bit. It's not perfectly clear. In part because I think it shifts historically, depending on what period we're looking at as far as the extraction of fish and fish meal in Peru. I think if you look at the contemporary period, I think in many cases you could look at the 5 mile zone as being an exterior, basically. And the state definitely treats it that way, as being something that is essentially external to the fish meal industry, and something that can not only absorb the extra labor, but also this kind of space of unregulation. They oftentimes talk about this as being a kind of black market space of unregulated labor, but also unregulated fishing. And in turn, there's another kind of interesting dynamic in this when you look at urban fisheries as a space of contamination. One of the fisheries, that I work on in Lima, we've been doing water testing at, and the coliform content is 3 or 4 times higher than what the USDA would establish as acceptable, right? In large part because of sewage being dumped into the ocean in those spaces. So it has certainly shifted, but I think at this point, I would say that interior zone, interior to the coastline, is actually functions in many ways as this kind of discursive exterior. The second part is a really interesting dynamic of this, and you're certainly correct. I mean, we're seeing this right now during a large El Nino, and this will have a tremendous effect on the fisheries next year as far as the productivity of that. But climate change, strangely enough, has not entered into, or has not yet entered into, any of the government discussions or the industry discussions about regulating the fishery. They're basically acting as though this is something that doesn't exist, and it won't impact the fisheries, but it is. I mean, it's something that is outside and beyond regulation at this point.
Thank you, Max.
Yeah, thanks.